This is the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast, hosted by David Charlton, and you're listening to this podcast to help you build your own mental toughness, or so that you can support other people or your clients better. Either way, you will learn more about developing this plastic personality trait that all but guarantees that you will perform better and lead a more prosperous life. Hi, welcome back from a beautiful, bright and sunny day here in Newcastle. As I look out of my window, don't think I can see a cloud. However, it's a bit cold out there. It's around about 10 degrees. So yeah, autumn is very much on the way, which naturally will be followed by colder weather and winter, something I'm not too fond of. Anyway, with regards to today's episode, we're going to look at mental health and the overlap with performance. There's an argument to say that I'm a week late here. I've missed the boat. International Mental Health Day was last week on Tuesday the 10th of October. However, this is purposeful that it is going out a week later. The reason being was I didn't want to be drowned out by all of the noise, all of the different social media posts, all of the different messages. So today, it's going to be a short, bite-sized episode. It's taken from episode 65, where clinical psychologist and author of the book, Skewed to the Right, Sport, Mental Health and Vulnerability, Dr. Amy Iskey, talks to me about the culture of sport. The words tough, mentally tough, resilient. You know, when we look at sport, these qualities are so important to go on to thrive and to perform well in sport. However, as Amy says, there is a negative side when we look at the extreme versions of toughness, mental toughness and resilience. It's a really interesting listen. I hope you go on to enjoy it.
You know, rowing does try and I think pride itself on being one of those sports where it says, you know, we're a really tough sport and only the toughest can do this. We have the toughest regime in the university. And that there's certain things that are worn almost as badges of honour by rowers, really, where, you know, you've got these horrific calluses on your hands, but it's almost as if, you know, they're proud of them. And the fact that we're up before anybody else is up, you know, that's something that's taken or seen with a lot of pride as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned the word tough there, which obviously links nicely to the podcast title there with demystifying mental toughness. How damaging can that word tough or toughness be for people?
Yeah, so I struggle a little bit with the word toughness, and I don't know how popular as an opinion that's going to be. But so as athletes, of course, you know, from personal experience and working with athletes as well, there is an element where, yes, we need to be tough. And certain personality traits such as focus, discipline, and aggression are celebrated. They're put on a pedestal. You know, these are the things that we celebrate in our athletes. Oh, they're so disciplined. They're so focused. But there can be a negative impact of that from a clinical perspective. And of course, I'm coming at this as a clinical psychologist and a psychodynamic psychotherapist. So for me, there's two things to consider here in terms of what's the impact of this. And I think the first one to think about is control. And the second thing is the extreme versions of this. So, you know, in order to meet our goals in sport, there has to be a level of aggression behind that. That's just a given. If we're not aggressive, we're not going to be in pursuit of those goals. So that can be helpful, but we have to be able to switch these traits on and off. So I'm sure you see athletes in the clinic quite often, potentially with anger or aggression difficulties, because aggression's great because it makes you strive for your goal. But ultimately, if you then can't control that on the pitch, it can put the individual and people around them at risk. So these are traits that we need to have control of. So the impact of them is that they can sometimes be quite damaging if we haven't got control of them. And of course, I'm talking about this as if it's an easy thing to do. We can just switch these things on and off within ourselves. And of course, that would be the case if we had conscious control of them. But as a psychodynamic psychotherapist, my interest lies in thinking about the unconscious world and what might be unconsciously driving us. And by the very nature of that, it suggests that we're not always aware of everything that's driving our behaviour. So that's sometimes when people would come and see me, because they might not have full insight or awareness into, well, why can't I control this? Something else is driving this. So that's the first impact, that we need to have control. But secondly, it's looking at the extreme versions of this. So what's the extreme version of toughness? Well, these personality traits within sport are helpful. There's no doubt about that. We need to be resilient. We need to be tough. The athlete that hits pain or something outside of their comfort zone and then says, oh, I'm done for today. They're kind of the athletes that potentially might not reach that high performance threshold because they give up when it gets uncomfortable. So we do need an element of pushing through the pain barrier or pushing through the comfort zone. But it's the extreme versions of this where it gets very unhelpful. So this is the argument of being skewed to the right. So the title of my book is Skewed to the Right. And I appreciate that my view on this is probably skewed because I'm a clinician. So I only see people that are struggling with this because they're coming into the clinic. But what I do see is that for people that don't fall within that average range for focus, discipline, masochism, and obsessionality, if they sit to the right of that, so they have higher levels of masochism or higher levels of obsessionality, which we do need for sport, by the very nature of having higher levels, they're then getting closer to that extreme end where we're looking at clinical significance. So to give you an example, if we think about the double-edged sword of masochism, so pushing through pain, we've just acknowledged that you need to be able to do that in order to push through your comfort zone and then achieve these incredible things. But then what happens if you then start to enjoy pain? And then what happens if pain becomes a familiar way in which you relate to yourself and the world? Potentially, we're then slipping into something like self-harming behaviour or bulimia. And that's very different to pushing through your comfort zone. And similarly with obsessionality, it's good to be obsessive about a training regime. We need to focus on our eating, our training, our sleep. But if we then become obsessive about things outside of sport, and that becomes pervasive within our everyday lives, and we can't leave a restaurant for an hour because we're obsessively aligning our cutlery and our glasses, then we're looking at something like OCD or obsessionality disorders. So it's really about the extreme versions of these that can be most concerning.
And in some ways that differentiates like my work from your work, where as a sports psychologist, I see that this tough mentality of pushing through, getting your head down and just getting on with things. And from that, I can see, aggressive behavior and the blame game, people like criticizing other people. What I can get involved in there is those responses, those actions, and how they can potentially change them. But also with that type of behavior, you tend to find people self-loathe and that they're quite very critical of themselves. So where I can support someone to try and change their dialogue inside there, obviously for you, your role is at a more deeper level there when you talk about potentially with OCD and self-harm and eating disorders.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we've had a bit of a conversation about this already in terms of the importance of identifying and educating about the difference in our work and our roles, and how important it is that people know the difference, in that, for sports psychology, and you're better to educate on this than me, David, this is what you do on a daily basis, but, it's about optimizing performance, and then also identifying if there are any mental health concerns, but if there are, then signposting onto someone like me, because then we get into the clinical psychology stuff, where it's tipped over into something a bit more unmanageable or distressing. And I think that's the most important thing to identify here, in that there are many people in the sporting world that have these character traits, but they're not distressing to them. They work for them. And in that sense, you or I just wouldn't get involved with them, actually, because they're functional, they work for them. And the only time that I would get involved is if someone says to me, look, this is what's going on, and it's starting to get quite distressing. It's starting to bubble over into something else in terms of mental health, and my wider life. And if they're then telling me that it no longer works for them, that's when we start to intervene.
Well, it was really interesting to listen back to that episode, or certainly part of that episode, and it really hit home to me, again, about the importance of keeping the conversation going about mental health, and then the overlap with sport and sporting performance. Playing sport, it has so many benefits, from the social aspect to the ambitious aspect, the goal setting that takes place, the discipline, and of course the mental toughness. Yet, as Amy mentioned, there are extremes at the end of the scale that go on to cause some issues. And certainly, in my work as a sports psychologist, I'll see many perfectionists. These guys, these athletes, who have crazy high expectations, rigid expectations, unrealistic expectations, so they're unable to free themselves up to play well in their chosen sports. What I don't often see, though, is the overlap with their everyday lives. I also come across the person who struggles with what I call comparisonitis. Essentially what we're talking about here is social approval. So they're always mind-reading their coaches, their teammates, their parents. They're worrying about what people think of them. They're predicting what other people are going to say to them at the end of a match. So they're anxious as a result. So again, as a sports psychologist, I'm going to try and help them. I'm going to try and guide their focus and their attention so that they can perform better. But yeah, there is going to be an overlap, I'm sure, in their everyday lives, in their work, in their education. And I suppose, as I look back, just thinking about these two challenges in themselves, what we're actually doing as sports psychologists is educating people through the vehicle of sport. So we're teaching them life skills, essentially. And yes, it's to be able to perform better in most cases, but also it's to be able to live happier, healthy lives. There's no doubt about it. In my role, we're trained, or at least some of us are trained. It's important to do your homework here. In counselling, we go on to have conversations about the death of a loved one, about relationship breakups, about bullying, about conflict in the family, about money issues. However, it is important for us as sports psychologists to know where our limitations lie. And as Amy says, to be able to signpost to people like Amy as a clinical psychologist. Personally, though, I'm quite lucky in that respect, as are the guys in my team. We're very fortunate because we've got a very, very good and experienced clinical psychologist as part of our team who helps to guide us and is always there for advice. That said, there are lots of people who do great work, including us, in that area. So my real parting message here is, if you do have any concerns that performance and mental health are connected, certainly overly connected, then really please do your homework. There's a lot of practitioners out there who call themselves sports psychologists or mental health advocates, yet they've read a book, maybe two, and they've done some short courses. It's really important to check out the credentials, the qualifications of the people that you're going to work with. I'd also check out the bodies that they're associated with too. That's very, very important. Mental health can be really, really complex, and it's certainly an area you don't want to be messing about with. So yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. And certainly on a more positive and upbeat note, should you want some help, should you want some tips and some tricks that can aid your performance and perhaps overlap with optimal well-being, please do sign up to the Mental Edge, our regular newsletter, which continues to grow and gain positive traction and feedback. Have a great day. If you enjoyed this episode of the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast with David Charlton, do check out my website, sport-excellence.co.uk, and my online sport psychology resources. The Sport-Excellence website has essential resources for anyone looking to build their own mental toughness or the mental toughness of their athletes or teams, or if you want to achieve peak performance more often or optimal functioning. The Sport Excellence website has everything you need to keep moving forward and thrive. So go on, head over to sport-excellence.co.uk to find out more.